The wording of the Mishnah often is, Hu haya omer, he used to say. Now, if you think about it, think about any great sage you know or have heard of, any great scholar that you've heard of, you could probably imagine that he used to say, or she used to say, more than a couple of things, right? I'm sure Hillel used to say quite a few things. So when we say Hu haya omer, we're referring to something that really spoke to the essence of the person and or the time in which he lived. And so Hillel lived in the time of King Herod. And Herod was one of the most ruthless rulers we've ever had in Jewish history. He was more aligned with the Romans than he was with the Jews, more interested in building up the Roman Greek aspects of the country, particularly on the coastal areas. You'll see Caesarea, you'll see many other areas where he was very much involved. And he was very involved in self-preservation, which is why we have these southern fortresses, such as Masada and Herodium, built for him really to protect himself, because he knew that he was in trouble with his own people. And yet Hillel, who had no official position, he was the Nasi, but that didn't come with an army, didn't come with a police force, it didn't come with anything significant. He was the one who really ruled the country in practical terms, very quietly, in a very humble type of way, very self-effacing. And Hillel was the one who everybody respected. And so leadership can take on a variety of different roles. It doesn't always have to be that person who's up there front and center. But nonetheless, he says as follows, Im ein ani li mili. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? V'kishani la'atzmi, but if I'm only for myself, ma'ani, what am I? V'im ein lo achshav, v'im lo achshav, and if not for now, emasai, when will it be? And I thought that was a very powerful leadership concept, not really our topic, but sort of a segue into where we're going. The idea that leadership is about building yourself. Obviously, you have to build your own capacity as a leader, with an idea, with a goal of giving over to somebody else, using your own abilities, using your vision, using your inspiration to then inspire and to guide other people, and to realize that leadership is all about the now. It's all about taking the moment, seizing the opportunity. And so I remember a colleague of mine, just at the same convention, told a story that during World War II, it got to a point where the Nazis were becoming more desperate, where Adolf Eichmann had negotiated with some of the Jewish leaders at the time that if the Jews were to send or find a way by which to send money to Europe, for every $100 that the Jews would finance, another Jewish person would be let go, another soul would be saved. And so Rav Shraga Feivel Mendelovich, who at the time was very much involved in Jewish affairs on a variety of levels, including Yeshiva Torah B'das, was frantically trying to raise money to save Jewish lives. And he comes to the Lower East Side, and there's a cleaner's that must have been very successful. He goes to the owner of the cleaner shop and he says to him, I need money to save Jewish lives. The guy says to him, over there is the register. Open it up, take out whatever you want. And you could use that money for your cause. So Shraga Feivel turned to them and he said, thank you very much, but I don't understand. Right? You're with me, we're in the same place, I'm looking at you right in the eye. How far apart could they be? The cash register is equidistant from them, maybe 20 feet from both of them. Why are you telling me to go into your register, to open it up and take out the money? Why don't you just walk to the register and give me the money? So he said to him something revealing about human character, in a sense, and the way that we interact with our scenarios. He said, because if I would go to the cash register, there's a good chance that by the time that I got there, I would have a change of heart. And maybe wouldn't be as inspired as I am now. So now here's my inspiration, I'm giving it over to you. And I want you to do with it as you see fit. And that's why he sent him to the register instead of doing it himself. And so all of us, I just heard a call for action, whether that's the Presidium or whether it's just in other areas for the organization. We all have this tendency, we are called Adam. Adam means we are created from Adama. We're created from the earth. The earth, even though the earth does produce, and even though the earth is the source in many ways of our sustenance, it is still fundamentally dirt, which means that we can be, as people, we can be stagnant, we could sort of regress into the non-active possibilities within our life. And so we have to push ourselves. We have to be inspired and we have to do something based on the inspiration, not wait till we get home, not wait for another week to think about it, but we have to be able during the moment when the call of action is in front of us to try to do something about it. I think that's really what the Avos are all about as well. When Avram is told Lech Lecha, he's not given a week to think about it. When he's told to take Yitzchak as a sacrifice on Mount Moriah for the Akedah, it's not like he now has time to determine the pros and cons, think about how it fits into his schedule, determine if it really fits his ultimate, value system in all of this. He's told, Vayashkem Avram baboker, right? Abraham gets up early in the morning. And that is the mantra of Jewish leadership. To get up early, to not ask questions unless, of course, the one who's communicating it is not God, but perhaps from another source, then we often do need that guidance. But once we are clear in the veracity and the validity of the mission, once we understand that this is the right thing to do, then we should not hesitate. Because ultimately that's what being a leader is all about. And so obviously all of us, each in our own way, have opportunities for leadership. And certainly it's a pleasure to reinforce that idea. And certainly if there's a way by which to move things forward, all of us should try our best to do so. And so I wanted to share with you a thought coming back now to the theme, the idea of dust, sand, and stars, and how that ties into Jewish history. So you may be familiar that the common thread between those three items is that they're all metaphorically related to Jewish destiny. But when the Avos, when Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, each in their own time, in their own place, they are told about the future progeny, the history of the Jewish people, we are compared to these items. Your children, your descendants will be so numerous, they'll be uncountable as these items, the dust, the stars, and between them the sand. And I'll mention the examples for you because I think the context is actually quite interesting. We find one, for example, at the end of the Akedah. After Avram had passed the test, he and Yitzchak had gone to the mountain together. The Malach calls out from the sky and says, do not take the life of this child. Al tishlach yadcha al anar, do not extend your hand to the child. And so Avram said, looks for some other replacement. And he finds a ram. And it's the ram that he brings up as a korban, and that's one of the bases for the shofar that we blow on Rosh Hashanah, because that's the anniversary date, and many other aspects there as well. And in the end, he says as follows, as part of the Malach saying, because you did this wonderful act, because you listened to me and did not ask questions, Ki barech avarechacha, I will bless you. B'harbe arbe ezaracha, I will make your children very numerous. Ki kochve hashamayim, like the stars in the sky. V'chachol asher al svas hayam, and like the sand along the seashore. And you will inherit the gates of your enemies. That's the promise we find with Avram. Later on, we find with regards to Yitzchak, in the parsha that we read yesterday, it says as follows, and this is in the context when there was a famine, that Avram and Sarah went down, not all the way down to Egypt, because Yitzchak was not allowed to go to Egypt, since he had been a sacrifice, even though that didn't actually fulfill the sacrificial process, but he had been elevated by the process, and therefore he was not allowed to leave the land of Israel. So instead he goes to, ironically, modern-day Gaza, to the land of the Plishtim, to Avimelech and his nation. And that's where he and his wife find food. And it says that they were much, Hashem said, don't be afraid, live there. And he continues and he says, Pasuk Daled, V'hir beisi ezaracha kechochvei hashamayim. I will make your children as numerous as the stars, and I will give them all the lands, etc. And finally we see a similar blessing with Yaakov. That's coming up in a short while in the Torah. And it says over there, V'haya zaracha ka'afar ha'aretz. Here we find, perhaps for the first time, I didn't check all the sources, but perhaps for the first time, compared to the dust of the earth. So the question is, well, why is it that we have these different metaphors, right? You would think that any one of them would be sufficient. And the other question, this is something that bothers me that I didn't see in the commentaries, but perhaps we can explore a possibility to answer this question as well. Why is it that this promise seems to be associated so often with times of difficulty? Why is it that really on the aftermath of the Akedah, when the future of the Jewish people was at stake, right? He had been waiting for decades. He and his wife Avram and Sarah had been waiting for decades for a child that would be their future. And finally they get this child, and Hashem says, go sacrifice this child. And not only that, but it undermined everything that they had taught. Because they taught in a world that practiced human sacrifice, that human sacrifice was evil. And yet here we're doing it to our own child. But that's one context. Yitzchak is in a situation where he's concerned about his safety. And in fact, Avimelech is somebody who potentially sought to take Sarah. That's why he had come up with this whole plan about Sarah being his sister instead of his wife. And then finally with Yaakov, as he's running away from Esav and running into the house of Lavan, two of the most crooked and dangerous people of his time, and Yaakov has to interact with both of them. Why is it that specifically we find that the promise of many children, it's one thing to promise the safety, but why is it that we have to keep coming back to a very numerous offspring, and that will be the future? So the Kli Yakar, one of the medieval commentators, talks about the first part. And he says as follows. He says that different times in Jewish history can be represented by the metaphors that we talked about. The stars represent being on top of the world. It represents when we are in our glory state. And the most classic example of that is in the time of King David and his son Solomon, David HaMelech and his son Shlomo, who were really very widely respected all throughout the world. And in fact, we find that Shlomo HaMelech had many wives from many of the other nations. Many people as converts wanted to join the Jewish people and to be part of their great temple and to be part of their great nation. And so we see that we have these times, and unfortunately for us, not too many, but we have periods of time where we're like stars on top of the world, where everybody looks up to us for guidance. Everybody wants to be connected with us. Everybody wants to come under that banner. And then we have that middle ground, which is the sand. If you've been to the beach, you know that the sand plays a very interesting role. The water comes, it hits a certain point, and then it recedes. And then the next wave comes, hits more or less that exact same point, and then it too recedes. And so the sand represents a boundary between the land and and on the other side the water. And the water which keeps coming down and crashing relentlessly over and over and over, but yet the sand holds its ground and the water recedes. And that represents a period which I think many of us can relate to today. You talked about having a bittersweet moment. I feel all of us are feeling to some degree a bittersweet moment. We're here together to celebrate, all of the wonderful work that we do, and yet in the world around us, what's going on in Israel, of course, tears our hearts, and what's going on elsewhere in France and in Kenya and other places where militant terrorism reigns supreme, or so it appears. And we feel like we are hopeless and helpless in such a case. And yet we find ways by which we've had situations like this before. We find ways by which to survive the moment. And that is the second stage, where we have flare-ups, where we have difficult times, but we're able to survive those moments. And then finally we have the dust that's on the ground, which is the ultimate example of being trampled upon. And interestingly, that's what Yaakov is, because Yaakov is Akev. Akev is a heel. And elsewhere we have a parsha named Akev, right towards the end of the Torah, in Devarim. V'haya Akev Tishmun, and Rashi says, if you will have mitzvot that are trampled on with your foot, as if you don't take them very seriously, this will be the consequence. And so for us, it represents us being trampled upon. It represents us being under the feet of the world around us. It represents utter despair. And we all know that we've had those moments as well, far too many. And even though there aren't that frequent, because they're so intense and because the suffering is so enormous, we mourn those moments and we remember them, and we feel like that's part and parcel of what Jewish history has been. And ultimately we wait for all of this for the time of Mashiach, when we could put all of the difficulties behind us and try to focus on the positives and all the goodness that awaits us in the future. And so when I was thinking about the idea, why is it that we have this promise seemingly each and every time that Hashem talks about what your progeny will look like in the numbers, why is it happening in the middle of difficult situations? And so I think that what Hashem is telling us is that we have a message of comfort here. What we have to understand is that, even when things look difficult, even when things look like we have no solutions and we don't really know how our salvation will appear, we have to realize that there is a future. There are children to come. There are many, many children to come. If you would have told any person who came to these shores in the 1940s, fleeing the persecution of World War II, or came in 1950 or thereabouts after the war, realizing that so much terrible things had occurred, if you would have given them any picture of what American Jewry could look like 70 years hence, and we have our challenges, we're losing people all the time to intermarriage and assimilation, there's no question about it. On the other hand, if you look at how there's been a renaissance of Torah Jewry, There's been a renaissance of people who are committed, right? An aspect of the Jewish community that was written off as passé, written off as having no future, written off as being basically gone. And the other movements within Judaism were the most robust, the ones that had the most adherents. And now we see how the statistics are changing. We see how the landscape is shifting. We see that orthodoxy and Torah commitment is the part that's really most vital in many ways, certainly proportionate, more vital than any other group in American Judaism and world Judaism today, world Jewry. And so we have certain things to look forward to. We have to recognize that despite the challenges of the moment, there's always something positive on the back end. And therefore we recommit to our future, to our children, and to everything that that future has in store for us. And so, I certainly am not here to offer any answers in the difficult time that we find ourselves in the world around us. But what I do know is that our commitment to our core values has always held us in good stead, has always been a bedrock, has always been a foundation, has always been something that we can hold on to, whether it's through tefillah, through our prayers and the recitation of Tehillim, whether through tzedakah, which we heard about before, giving to people locally, giving to people elsewhere. We know that our acts make a difference. And we know that each and every one of us is an important player. And I'm going to end with a story to capture this idea. There was a gentleman who had come to a certain camp in the Catskill Mountains. He was an older person, and he was also very sick. And he was part of the learning that was going on in the Beit Midrash in the house of study in that particular camp on a daily basis, and he was showing up day after day. And one day he confides in one of the rabbis over there that he's really very sick. He's suffering from a cancerous tumor, and he doesn't know how much longer he's going to be able to come in to learn. But the rabbi was surprised because he had been so vital, so engaged, so participatory. But eventually, over time, he started to see that things were getting worse and worse. And so the man turns to the rabbi and says, I'm not sure that I can push myself anymore. It's tough, it's hard. I'm not really sure I'm making such a difference. Is it really worth it for me to schlep myself here every day in order to do, this learning? Maybe I'm not really in that position any longer. I'm not sure I'm going to be coming any longer. So the rabbi tells him, I just heard something fascinating yesterday. It's a story that had nothing in theory to do with what was going on in our Beis Medrash, but I want to share it to you because it tells you, it captures, share it with you because it captures a very important idea. And he talks about a certain conductor whose name I forget at the moment. And this conductor had to be elsewhere at a particular time that there was a symphony orchestra that was playing. And he wanted to hear it. It was before the times of streaming live, internet television. He couldn't see it directly, but he was able to access shortwave radio recording of the symphony. And there was another person who was, I guess, his biographer, and so he was with him. And he asked the conductor, can I be with you while you listen to this transmission of the symphony over the shortwave radio? I won't say anything, I won't bother you. The man said, if you're absolutely silent, you can be there. If you make any disturbance whatsoever, you'll have to leave. And so the man agrees, and he's sitting there, and the man is listening to the radio, the conductor, and he's hearing the entire beautiful symphony orchestra playing. And everything sounds so wonderful. And at the end, the biographer says to the leader of this orchestra, he says to him, what a beautiful performance. Everything was great. And the man said, it was very nice, but there were 120 musicians that were supposed to be part of this, and I can tell of the 15 violinists, one of them was missing. And the guy thought he was nuts, or thought he was joking with him. So the biography picks up the phone, he calls Europe, where the symphony was taking place, or had taken place, and he said to him, tell me, what was the composition of your orchestra last night? And the man said, well, we were supposed to have 120 people, but one person didn't show up, so we only had 14 people on the violin. So it goes back to the conductor, and he says, well, how did you know? He said, because if you don't know what's going on, everything sounds so beautiful. But if you know what everybody's job is, if you know what everyone's responsibility is, if you know exactly what's supposed to happen you know when somebody is not filling in a particular void. You can hear that something is missing. And by listening to it, I was able to determine that one violin wasn't part of the ensemble. And as a result, I felt that it wasn't as perfect as it could have been. And so the rabbi now turns to the cancer-stricken friend that he had made in the camp over the last number of weeks and months, and he says to him, I want you to know that all of us, every one person, plays a role, has some job to fulfill in God's orchestra, in God's symphony. We may not recognize it at any particular moment. We sometimes say to ourselves, well, what's my job? Do I really matter? Am I so important? Let somebody else do it. But when we recognize that each of us has that role, and without us, the ensemble cannot be complete, no matter what anyone else does to try to fill in the gaps, we recognize that we really do have an important role in life. And we have to be able to willingly try to fulfill that. So whatever our call to action is, whatever it is that we have to do in life, we have to realize that we have a special place. That each of us was put here for a special, unique purpose that nobody else could possibly come to fulfill. And if we operate with that recognition, if we realize that we're part of God's destiny, that even though we're one of millions and millions and we look like a little speck of dust, a little grain of sand, we're just but a single star way out in the galaxy that you can't even see, and somebody's going to make $100 naming that star after me, but it's not really so significant. But if you realize that in God's ensemble, that in the world in which we live, each of us plays a central role, and nobody can replace it. Maybe the average person can't discern my unique role, but the ultimate conductor can. He sees what each of us can do. He put us here for a reason, and he knows what we're here to accomplish. And so if we can capture the essence of that message, then hopefully not only can we do more for the people around us who desperately need it, and for the organizations that we need it, we can realize in and of itself, if I'm not for myself, who am I? I need to build myself up, but it has to be v'shani la'atzmi. It can't just be for me. Ma'ani, I can't be anything meaningful if I'm not for others. And the call to action, the time for action, the time for change, for growth, for improvement, for whatever we need to do is achshav, is now. And that's the power of Hillel, that's the power of the metaphor. And Be'ez Hashem, God willing, for all of us, we can internalize that message and utilize it to help advance the organization, as well as advance our personal lives and the lives of others around us. Thank you very much.